Somewhere off the coast of California, in the cold gray water surrounding a cluster of jagged rocks called the Farallon Islands, something happened that should not have been possible. A creature that has ruled the oceans for over 11 million years, a predator so feared that entire industries exist just to keep swimmers away from it, turned its back and fled for its life. Whale watchers on a small boat that October morning had come to see seals and maybe a passing gray whale. What they witnessed instead was the ocean's food chain rewriting itself in real time. Two black and white shapes moved through the water with terrifying coordination, and within minutes, a great white shark, one of the largest ever documented in the region, was dead, its liver torn out with surgical precision. By the time the sun set that day, every single white shark in the area, nearly 100 of them, had vanished from the Farallones. They would not come back for the rest of the season. This is the story of how the ocean's most feared hunter learned to be afraid, and of the predator that taught it that lesson, the orca, and its silent, brutal coup against the great white shark. For decades, the great white shark occupied an almost mythical place at the top of the marine hierarchy. Weighing up to 2.5 tons and stretching over 6 meters in length, it possesses a bite force exceeding 4,000 pounds per square inch, rows of serrated teeth built for shearing through flesh and bone, and an electroreceptive sense so refined it can detect the faint electrical pulse of a heartbeat buried in the sand. Off the coast of central California, the waters surrounding the Farallon Islands became one of the most famous white shark aggregation sites on the planet, a place scientists nicknamed the Red Triangle because of the sheer density of shark activity concentrated there every autumn. Between September and December, elephant seals haul out onto the rocky shorelines to breed, and the sharks arrive like clockwork, patrolling the surf zone and launching explosive ambush attacks on unsuspecting seals. Researchers at the Monterey Bay Aquarium and Point Blue Conservation Science have spent years tracking this ritual, tagging white sharks with acoustic devices to study exactly how these predators dominate the ecosystem around the islands. On an average season, biologists there recorded around 40 separate seal predation events carried out by white sharks. It was, for a long time, considered an unshakable natural order. The sharks owned these waters, and nothing challenged that ownership. Then the orcas arrived, and the entire equation collapsed. Killer whales are not new to the Farallones. Transient orca pods pass through the region periodically, hunting the same elephant seals that draw in the sharks, along with sea lions and occasionally gray whale calves during migration season. But orcas visit only rarely, sometimes going years without a confirmed sighting near the islands. What scientists eventually discovered is that it does not matter how rarely the orcas show up, because their effect on the sharks is immediate and absolute. In a landmark study published by a team of researchers from Stanford University, Montana State University, and the Monterey Bay Aquarium, scientists combined nearly 3 decades of wildlife survey data with information collected from 165 tagged white sharks to measure exactly what happens when these two apex predators cross paths. The results were staggering. Every single time orcas were detected within roughly 3 kilometers of southeast Farallon Island, the tagged white sharks fled the area within minutes. Not slowly, not cautiously circling back later that day, but immediately and completely. And once they left, they did not return, in some cases for an entire year, even though the orcas themselves were often just passing through and gone within hours. To understand how dramatic this is, consider what happened in the fall of 2009. 17 white sharks, all of them fitted with electronic tracking tags, were simultaneously patrolling the waters around the Farallones, engaged in their usual seasonal hunt. Then, within a matter of hours, every single one of them left. Not 2 or 3 stragglers, but all 17 tagged sharks, vacating a hunting ground that under normal circumstances they would occupy for weeks or even months at a stretch. Salvador Jorgensen, the senior research scientist who led much of this work, has described the sharks' reaction to orcas as something close to blind panic, a level of avoidance behavior rarely documented in any marine predator, let alone one considered untouchable by virtually everything else in the sea. The predation rate on elephant seals in the area dropped to nearly 0 in the days following an orca appearance, meaning the seals that the sharks would normally have killed were left completely unmolested, an entire trophic level of the ecosystem thrown into disarray by the mere presence of killer whales passing through. What makes this behavior even stranger is that the sharks often flee before they could possibly see the orcas coming. The waters around the Farallones are murky and cold, visibility frequently reduced to just a few meters, and orcas have been documented triggering shark evacuations from distances far beyond what sharks could see or hear underwater. Jorgensen and his colleagues believe the most likely explanation lies in scent. Sharks possess an extraordinarily refined sense of smell, capable of detecting particular compounds in the water at concentrations of parts per billion, and researchers suspect the sharks may be picking up a chemical signature released by orcas themselves, or perhaps a stress compound released by another shark that has already had a close encounter and fled the scene in a state of alarm. In one particularly telling case, researchers tracked a group of white sharks located hundreds of kilometers away from the Farallones at the exact moment orcas arrived at the islands. Sometime after the killer whales had come and gone, those distant sharks approached the islands, seemingly testing the waters, only to turn around and leave again almost immediately, as though some residual signal in the water was warning them that danger had recently passed through, even without a single visual or acoustic cue to go on. The reason behind this extreme caution goes back to that very first documented encounter in October of 1997, an event that changed how marine biologists understood the relationship between these two predators forever. On that day, whale watchers aboard a tour boat near the Farallones witnessed two orcas execute a coordinated, methodical attack on an adult great white shark. Working together, the killer whales flipped the shark, a defense mechanism that induces a state of temporary paralysis in sharks known as tonic immobility, and then, with what researchers would later describe as disturbing precision, tore open the space between the shark's pectoral fins and extracted its liver, leaving the rest of the carcass largely untouched. It was the first time in recorded history that scientists had directly observed orcas killing and eating a great white shark, and the aftermath was immediate. The entire white shark population around the islands, close to 100 animals in total, abandoned the area for the remainder of that season, skipping the seasonal elephant seal hunt entirely and losing out on months of feeding in the process. That single, brutal event echoed through the population for years, and it planted the first seed of a question that scientists are still trying to fully answer. Why do orcas target the liver, and why does it terrify white sharks so completely? The answer lies in shark biology itself. Unlike bony fish, sharks lack a swim bladder, the gas-filled organ most fish use to control buoyancy. Instead, sharks rely on an enormous liver, often making up as much as a quarter of their total body weight, saturated with low-density oils that help keep them from sinking. In a shark the size of an adult great white, that liver can weigh several hundred pounds and is packed with dense, calorie-rich fat, essentially a natural energy reserve evolved over millions of years. For an orca, an animal that can require hundreds of pounds of food per day to sustain its massive body and active hunting lifestyle, a great white's liver represents one of the richest, most efficient meals available anywhere in the ocean. Researchers studying this behavior have compared it to a human craving butter or bacon, an instinctive pull toward the most calorie-dense option on the menu. But what makes orca behavior truly remarkable is not just the choice of target, it is the surgical consistency of the attack. Time and again, in necropsies performed on shark carcasses that washed ashore after suspected orca attacks, biologists have found nearly identical wounds, a clean incision between the pectoral fins, the liver removed, and comparatively little other damage to the body. It is not the chaotic tearing typical of many predator kills. It looks, in the words of one researcher who examined the carcasses, like an operation performed with a scalpel. This same pattern of behavior did not stay confined to California. Thousands of miles away, off the southern coast of South Africa, in towns like Gansbaai and Mossel Bay, long famous among tourists and researchers for their dense populations of great white sharks, an eerily similar phenomenon began appearing around 2015 and intensified dramatically by 2017. Marine biologists in the region, including researchers from South African national parks, documented multiple great white shark carcasses washing ashore, each missing its liver, each bearing the same precise wound pattern first identified off the Farallones 2 decades earlier. Investigators eventually linked the killings to a specific pair of male orcas that had become locally famous, nicknamed Port and Starboard, for the distinctive shapes of their dorsal fins, one curling to the left and the other to the right. These 2 killer whales, sometimes working with other members of their pod, were tied to a wave of shark disappearances so severe that entire bays known for generations as reliable white shark habitat saw their shark populations effectively vanish. In Mossel Bay, tour operators who had built entire businesses around guaranteed great white sightings suddenly found the water empty, week after week, for months at a stretch. When the sharks did eventually return, cautiously and in reduced numbers, further orca sightings would send them fleeing all over again, and each subsequent absence lasted longer than the one before it, stretching in some cases beyond a full year. The scale of this predation, both in South Africa and California, is very likely far larger than what has actually been documented. As already noted, sharks lack a swim bladder, so once dead, they sink rather than float, and when one is killed by an orca out in open water, far from shore, the body typically drops straight to the bottom before it could ever wash ashore to be studied. Biologists studying this pattern suggest that the handful of carcasses that do wash ashore each year represent only a small fraction of the true number of kills, most of them occurring silently and unseen far out to sea. In other words, this is not a rare, isolated behavior confined to a couple of famous individual orcas. It appears increasingly to be an emerging, learned hunting strategy, one that may be spreading through orca populations via cultural transmission, the same process by which killer whale pods pass down specialized hunting techniques from one generation to the next. The same mechanism that has allowed different orca populations around the world to develop wildly different specialties, from beaching themselves to snatch seals off the shore in Argentina to systematically hunting the tongues out of blue whales in other regions entirely. The ecological consequences of this predator versus predator relationship ripple outward in ways that scientists are only beginning to fully map. When white sharks abandon a hunting ground like the Farallon Islands, they do not simply disappear from the ecosystem, they redistribute. Tagged sharks fleeing the Farallones have been tracked relocating to other stretches of the California coastline, including well-known aggregation sites like Año Nuevo and Tomales Point, both of which already host their own resident populations of white sharks feeding on their own seal colonies. This creates a cascading pressure effect, as displaced sharks compete with local populations for the same limited number of seals, potentially straining food availability across a wider stretch of coastline than the orcas themselves ever physically visit. Meanwhile, back at the Farallones, the seals that would have been hunted are left alone, at least temporarily, shifting the entire local balance between predator and prey. And there is a further twist to the story, because researchers investigating the drop in elephant seal predation also began to worry about a secondary cost to the sharks themselves. If displaced white sharks are forced into more competitive waters with less reliable access to seals, some scientists suspect this could leave them in poorer physical condition heading into their long winter migration across the open Pacific, a journey that already pushes these animals to the edge of their physiological limits, even without added competition for food. What this relationship ultimately reveals is that there is no single, fixed apex predator sitting comfortably at the top of the ocean's food chain. Great white sharks have spent millions of years perfecting the art of ambush predation, refining a body plan so effective it has barely changed since long before the first humans walked the earth. Yet, in the presence of the orca, an animal that hunts not with solitary instinct, but with complex social coordination and knowledge passed down across generations, even the great white becomes prey. It does not fight back. It does not stand its ground. It simply leaves as fast and as far as it can, sometimes for a year or more, guided by nothing more than a trace lingering in the water. There is no ongoing war fought battle by battle along the California coast or the shores of South Africa, only the sudden arrival of a killer whale pod, a brief and often unseen encounter, and then an empty stretch of water where, just hours before, the ocean's most feared predator had reigned unchallenged. The great white shark did not lose its crown in open combat. It lost it the moment it learned to run.